Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for being here at the end of this 3-day, really interesting meeting. But I realize that we're almost at the end, so I'll try and make this. I'll expedite this. So basically, the goal of this presentation, which I think we decided to have about 6 days ago when I was in Korea at Coast Bar, in part talking about this with potential partners, is to tell you where we are right now. I need you to understand that there is no international lunar year right now, but there is a bunch of us, the coalition of the willing, working toward it. And the goal here is to bring you up to speed with what we're doing. And really, I hope, emphasize to you that although there's been a small group of us working this so far behind the scenes, that's not how we anticipate that going forward. We are here to look for and solicit your input and your enthusiasm. So basically, to set the stage for this, the idea of an international lunar year is that it is a way of getting stakeholders, partners around the world to do something and unify on a science topic far beyond what scientists can do by themselves, or artists, or even politicians. And the stage or the template was set by the International Lunar Geophysical, or the International Geophysical Year, which ran from 57 to 58. And it was really a post-World War II, the new order of how things were set up. It was a UN, it was under the auspices of the UN. And the International Lunar Year, or I keep saying that, the International Geophysical Year, and there have been several since, this is the first one, was a vehicle to allow people to get together in ways that were otherwise difficult for them to do. And it led to a lot of sharing. So, for example, there was a lot of celebration. There were stamps generated. The U.S. Postal Service, the Soviet Union issued stamps to celebrate the International Geophysical Year. The Republic of Indonesia, Haiti, African countries, Europe, Norway. The point was that this was truly an international effort. But there were scientists from, for example, the USSR and the United States who were able to work together in ways that they couldn't otherwise easily do. And they were able to bring in scientists from other nations, for example, like Indonesia, where perhaps we might not normally have seen scientists at meetings, particularly in the global north. And so the point was, this mechanism was a very effective way of bringing people together in a way that there really wasn't, and even today isn't, another vehicle to do. And it led to a whole pile of things. It enabled collaborations between scientists. It enabled new data sharing standards. It enabled the establishment of its long-running legacies, including the Antarctic Treaty, which we still have today. So this is the kind of framework that we're looking to kind of work within. There are lots of international years. Unfortunately, often they are not very well advertised, and so we've no idea there is one until it's happened 2 or 3 years past. Our goal, particularly with the moon as the theme, is that we would advertise this well ahead of time and during the process. And I think the moon gives us a unique opportunity to do that. Why do we want an international lunar year? Okay, well, first, this is, and Kathy alluded to this, we've heard this throughout the last few days. There is a very good chance we will see human beings on the moon again before this decade is out. That is something that many of us in this room were not alive for the last time that happened. So this is an exciting time. The other thing is that, notwithstanding the fact that there's a whole pile of angst geopolitically in the world right now, when people see humans work together to do really hard things, it inspires them. And, all credit to the folks at the State Department, the US government, and NASA working on the Artemis Accords to make sure that there is global buy-in from what they're doing. Equally, the Chinese government is working with partners to develop, for example, their vision for what a lunar base would look like. But wouldn't it be cool if we were all working together, at least through some mechanism? So we know that there's lots of missions that are planned. Some of those will carry humans, many of them won't, but you'll still have a scenario where even relatively small countries that historically have not been involved in space exploration will be sending payloads to the moon. The fact is that the moon is deeply meaningful to, if you don't know what the moon is, there's something weird going on. We all know what it is. More so than I think if you ask someone what geophysics is. And so it's something that we can all intimately tie to and relate to, and it underpins a huge amount of our culture as human beings, not just the ones that look like me or the folks in this room. And I think that's a really important point. Importantly, an ILY can do two things from a geopolitical perspective, and we exist within that framework. We might not like to think of it or commonly think of it as scientists, but everything is geopolitical, everything, including the funding we get. And an ILI allows two things in particular to happen. One, potentially adversarial nations can have their scientists communicate through a vehicle, like Chinese scientists right now, and a way of bypassing the Wolf Amendment, or working with scientists in the former Soviet Union. Right now, Russia is being a total dick. But that doesn't mean that everyone inside Russia agrees with that. And it is inhibiting their ability to do science too. And importantly, most countries on Earth do not have a space program or a space agency, but they may feel just as interested in what they do or what's happening in terms of what humans are doing in space as we are. And there are countries, particularly in the global south, that for the foreseeable future probably won't be sending astronauts somewhere. But this is an opportunity and a vehicle to engage people because their views matter just as much as ours. And an International Lunar Year transcends the normal geopolitical stuff and is a vehicle for us to do this. So we were arguing that this is critical. And there's no better time to do it than in the next few years. I'll talk about the specific timing in a moment because of what's happening as we're going back to the moon. Okay, so there are particular things that can happen from a science perspective. And the biggest point here, I think these slides are going to be available somewhere in this talk is recorded, so I'm not going to read all the words here. But I want to draw your attention to a few of the points that I'm putting down in this list here. By talking with other scientists from any nation you can think of that will want to get engaged with this, we can establish things like data standards. Now, some of you may know that I work heavily with NASA's PDS system. Planetary Data System. And one of the things that we've been working on and that I'm very proud that we're able to do is that there are now, for example, scientists in Japan, in China, across the ESA, who are using the standards that have been established for PDS data here. And that's not to say that this is the best system, but it's a good system and it's gone through a lot of work. And whether there are other approaches we could use, that's fine. But by standardizing stuff, it makes those data a lot more useful. And so this is a vehicle in which, again, these data can be communicated, these standards and best practices communicated to folks. And not just for science data, but for engineering and safety data too. There are works underway through, for example, the Artemis Accords to help establish commonalities in electricity voltage or in airlock design so that multiple nations could go and basically interact with each other on the moon or help in search and rescue. This is a way in which we could enable this too, because the assumption is Artemis is just the start of a long-term human presence on the moon. Organizing global science exchange programs, especially beyond what national space agencies are doing. There are always geopolitical considerations in what space agencies can and cannot do. Whereas if there's a grassroots way of doing it through universities or research organizations that are not beholden to, say, federal rules, or at least some federal rules, then it means then there's perhaps a better opportunity to exchange with folks who might otherwise have an opportunity to do that. Involvement in network science, for example, geophysical nodes, right? We can space weathering and dust monitoring stations, cosmology, putting stuff on the far side of the moon to do deep space cosmology. You know, there's a whole pile of science you can do, bio stuff I haven't even talked about here. And again, depending on what that nation is or what those scientists are able to do, it could be hardware, it could be offering data analysis, it could be any number of things. And then importantly, coordinating observational campaigns. Now, I'll talk a little bit about that too, but there's a lot of science we don't understand about the moon, and there are things we can observe on Earth or with space assets that right now, perhaps we're not able to coordinate all that well. So the idea is that it should encompass existing international collaborations, but it can and should go beyond, because some of our collaborations right now are necessarily restricted by law, or just by the fact that sometimes people don't like each other at certain levels. But that doesn't mean it has to apply to the scientists who don't make those geopolitical decisions. Education and outreach. There's an enormous potential here. And any of you who've ever done any kind of outreach, we at WashU brought a whole pile of students down to Bollinger Mills, about an hour and a half south, well, 5 hours south, thanks to they shut the motorways on the day, but for the total eclipse in April. We had 2,000 randos in a field listening to us talk about the origin of the moon, the first moonrise, the first eclipse. People love this stuff, even if they don't have any formal training in it. This is an opportunity to do it in a way. I mean, there's already a huge amount of work happening, right? For example, International Observe the Moon Night. There's things like International Moon Day, Uri's Night. There's lots of astronomical and cosmological events. It doesn't mean subsuming them. It doesn't mean that they become part of something. But for example, within an International Lunar Year, they put that logo on what their activities are. They put it on their webpage. We have a centralized webpage where we put all this stuff together, and it helps people to understand what's going on and motivates us to do additional outreach activities that we might not otherwise do. Everything from citizen science for lunar science and exploration, telescope observing campaigns, again, maybe not necessarily science-driven ones, but simply helping people see what the moon looks like up close. Eclipse viewing events, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Sharing cultural stories of the moon. I think most of us know a lot about the moon from a cultural perspective, but most of us are probably Anglo-originating people. And there are myths and origin stories of the moon that every people on this planet have. And we don't know them, at least I don't. And I think it would be cool to have a vehicle to share those things, because that's another way in which we can share our humanity through the lens of lunar science and exploration. Engaging artists, poets, musicians. This is just one line here, but this is an enormous thing into itself, right? Think of the stuff you could do that is already happening. You could bring it under this umbrella effort, and also setting up new activities. The Great Lunar Expedition for Everyone Glee. I mean, there's lots. This is another example. And I should have said this in the outset. These slides are riffing on a set of slides that Rachel Kleeman put together. I'll talk a little bit about our structure towards the end. There's one more big thing here, which is the policy infrastructure side of things. Right, so there is a thing called the UN COPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And this agency, or this committee within the United Nations framework, does a huge amount of stuff, and it's a pretty big deal. In fact, we're going to propose to go through them, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But they're developing, or they're proposing this thing, they proposed at one of their meetings in February, an action team on lunar activities consultation, ATLAC. This is something, if we were to push forward for an international lunar year, would actually help expedite pulling that together and setting out a set of metrics that would justify what they would do, and then work out how we would meet those metrics. But there are critical issues that we need to talk about. And some of these discussions are happening already, but not enough of them and not fast enough. Tracking lunar spacecraft and debris. I mean, we're living in the fact that we are probably one bad collision from a Kessler syndrome in Earth orbit, low Earth orbit. We want to make sure that we're avoiding stuff. And we heard at COSPAR last week that the Danuri spacecraft, the Korean one, has made several trajectory avoidance maneuvers already. But we do not have a concentrated, organized air traffic control management. Well, we barely have one for our Earth, but we definitely don't have one for the moon. We also have issues like operational standards for how we interact with each other to make sure that we're not going to kill each other. I think we are all probably, if you read the stuff that Phil Metzger is putting out, we're probably all underestimating just how bad the blast radius is, or the blast effects are going to be from these landers, right? And like we heard, it's not the plume, it's the stuff it's kicking up. Just go and look at the Apollo 17 video on YouTube and watch how all that stuff flies off within 2 frames, right? Setting standards for, I mean, I think Clive, you might have mentioned this the other day, landing pad infrastructure, right? Standards for this, much less actually implementing it. And then ultimately, how do we balance the inevitable eventual resource extraction from the moon with the fact that, and this is an issue we've seen in the context of putting stuff on the moon, or, for example, the 30-meter telescope in Hawaii, right? The moon is not necessarily just a thing for us to use. Some people might think that way, but others won't. So how do we balance the considerations and the needs we will have for lunar in situ resource utilization to keep humans alive there with the fact that the moon is sacred to a great many people? Right? I don't know the answer to that question. The ILY is the kind of vehicle we could try to use to ask that question. Why 2028? Okay. It was going to be 2027, but now it's 2028. So we found out last week that there are, principally, we think this should go through the UN. Now, to be very clear, most all things are made up. And if we just in this room agree to have an international lunar year, well, then that's half the work done already. So really, we can have it whenever we want. Going through the UN means that we can activate and use their resources and their infrastructure through international and national organizations across the world. And having the imprimatur of the UN will carry a great deal of weight and help us advertise this and socialize it. Because of the UN structures for how these things get proposed, even though we're kind of late already, we won't be able to have this formally endorsed and underway until 2028. Now, that doesn't mean we can't start earlier, but it does mean that the sort of formal year will be the year of 2028. What this means is we have time, not much, but we have time to pull together things like how we would propose to resolve some of these issues. 2028 happens to nominally be the Artemis 4 landing date. It may be the Artemis 3 landing date, but the point is
we're going to hopefully have humans around this time. There are 4 eclipses in mid-2017, 2027 to mid-2028. In January, there's an annular solar eclipse here, and in July, there's a total solar eclipse there, particularly here in the global south. That gives, I mean, okay, Australia is not quite considered the global south, but the point is there's a lot of outreach opportunity here for us. More to the point, there is a planned International New Year Planetary Defense in 29, and we don't want to conflict with them. But we would complement that by doing 28 and 29. And to be clear, it doesn't have to be just 12 months, right? But this is nominally, we would just, the marketing, the labeling will be 2028. And there's also something that which is part of another UN committee, the Space 2030 Agenda for the space as a driver for peace. They're doing a review in 2030, and this would be a cool thing to have wrapped up by then that would fit into this geopolitical framework for how we could understand the moon as part of using space for peace. Right now, there's a coalition of the willing who are lending their time, and it's largely stochastic in terms of how we got together, and it was mainly because David Reinecke reached out to a few of us about a year ago. And we need a core group of people to get this thing going, but we do not at all need or want this to be exclusive. In the next few weeks, we're hoping to start to more formally develop the structure of what we think we need with a view to reaching out to the community and then actively soliciting a whole pile of things. We want your ideas. For example, we need to build an international steering committee. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anyone in this room will be on that committee, because we want to have maybe no more than 15, and maybe that's 1 person from the US, maybe 2. But we want your ideas for who we could reach out to. We also want to get your ideas for which organizations we could get endorsements from. We've talked informally with COSPAR, with AGU, with NASA. They've given their blessing, but we don't have anything in writing yet. These endorsements mean that when we go to the UN or other potential partner agencies or institutions, it'll carry a bit more weight than if it's just a bunch of randos using a Gmail account. We also want your ideas for how to reach out to colleagues around the world. I had a chat briefly with Andy Shaner, I think he's gone now, but in 15 minutes, he had 10 great ideas. And I'm sure all of you have. We need to make a probably Google sheet to begin to solicit and contribute and collate those ideas so that we can begin to build this thing together. We also make sure that we are going to build a US team as well that we anticipate will formally advise the International Steering Committee. If you're interested in helping, reach out to us. This is our email address. I guess we're going to have to, I realized this about 8 minutes ago, we're probably going to have to change and make a different email address, but we'll link this one to the other one because originally we were going for 27 and then we found out how the UN works. But I promise, if you email International Lunar Year 2027 at gmail.com, it'll probably redirect to one we'll set up this evening to 2028, but we will get your email, or you can email me or Rachel Klima or Clive. I think these slides will be available, and certainly the recording is, so you'll see this, and you will begin to see emails in the Lunar Listserv in the next few weeks, in the Planetary Pen. We are looking actively for ideas to engage you and your colleagues, and anything goes, right? It doesn't just have to be science. But the goal here is that if we start now, we have the possibility of running an International Lunar Year in 28. We can capitalize on that, and maybe thereafter, look for an international decade of the moon in maybe the 2030s. That's it. Thank you.